This is a disclaimer. I am not a paranormal investigator. I am an author. While looking for inspiration for a book, I came across a series of stories surrounding a home in the American Pacific Northwest. It is an extremely unextraordinary looking house in an extremely unextraordinary looking residential neighborhood. But the stories that have emanated from its former residents and the people who lived in the town that it's located in are quite extraordinary. Through my research of the house on Wendall Lane, I have come across accounts that range from the supernatural to just plain bizarre. In order to protect the privacy of the people in the town and the current inhabitants of the house on Wendall Lane, I have not only changed the name of everyone in these stories, but the name of the street as well. Wendall Lane is just an alias for the true location of these accounts. Alan Palmer lived in the house on Wendall Lane from September 2002 to July 2003. After months of trying to contact him about his time there, I finally received an email agreeing to set up a meeting. Quite a few of the house's prior residents have turned down my requests for face-to-face interviews, so I jumped on the chance to talk to him in person once the opportunity presented itself. Palmer, who worked as a socioeconomics professor at the University of Washington, arranged to meet with me and talk over drinks at a place of his choosing in downtown Seattle. The bar was called Oliver's Lounge, and it was located in the historic Mayflower Park Hotel. Upon arriving, I was surprised just to see how crowded it was for 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. I spotted Palmer in the corner sitting at a small high table and sipping on a glass of scotch. He greeted me with a hearty handshake and a bright smile. After I introduced myself to him, this man was graying a little around the ears, and I could tell shortly after meeting him that he was incredibly intelligent. But aside from that, he seemed to have the demeanor of a fellow 15 years his junior. Palmer was a light-hearted gentleman who loved a good joke, and he insisted on telling me a few of his favorites before I turned my tape recorder on. Once he had his fun, we started the interview. Believe it or not, you're not the first person who's tried to contact me about that time I spent living on Wendall Lane. Apparently there are all kinds of ghost enthusiasts out there who've heard about the house through the various online forums these types of people tend to frequent. Nerds and losers. You know the type. They spend their time sifting through thread after thread on the internet, pretending they're doing something productive with their lives. How most of them are probably overweight man-children sitting in their parents' basement conducting their research in between anime cartoons. Palmer let out a laugh, seemingly pleased with his depiction of the paranormal research community. I decided to admit the fact that I first heard of him through one of those online forums he was talking about. He took a sip of scotch and continued on. So naturally, I ignored your emails thinking you were another one of those ghost geeks. It's strange. I probably wouldn't have even agreed to meet, but I came across one of your books by accident. My nephew mentioned your work in passing when I was over at my brother's house a couple days ago, and I put two and two together and realized that you were the same author who had been emailing me, so I figured why the hell not? I'm game to talk if you are. Although I must admit, my story's probably not as interesting as demons or monsters or whatever the hell it is you write about. Not a whole lot happened to me while I was living in there. In fact, the only real reason I lived in the house for such a short period of time was because of an old colleague of mine. He offered me a full professorship here at the University of Washington not long after I purchased it, and the commute was just too far. My workplace at the time had no job security. I was on the chopping block every year, so there was no way I could turn down the offer. This was before the housing burst in '07. It was a seller's market. Banks were giving away loans like there was no tomorrow, so it wasn't difficult to turn right back around and flip the place. Hell, I even made 30 grand. Plus, I love Seattle. Weather sucks, but the city has culture. We made small talk for a bit. He told me some stories about work, his travels to Europe, and he even asked me about some of the upcoming books that I've been working on. I was beginning to wonder if flying all the way to Seattle to speak to him had been a big waste of time. After all, Palmer appeared almost completely uninterested in discussing any and all aspects of the house. I directed his attention back towards the reason why we had met, when I asked him to describe the most bizarre encounter he could remember having in the short time he lived on Wendall Lane. Now you're starting to sound like the internet ghost geeks. Fine. Let me think. Like I said, nothing really strange ever happened, that's what. He paused for a minute and looked at the window towards the street. There was one thing. I'd almost forgotten about it. TV incident. It was a Friday night in June, about a month before the house sold. There was nothing on. You know, crappy television programming on the weekends, especially in the summertime. I was scrolling through channels on my TV's menu looking for something to watch and turn my brain off to when the title of a show caught my eye. It was called You Shouldn't Watch. I figured with a name like that, how could I not give it a go? Also, the show was on a channel I have never seen before. Channel 732. To be honest, I don't really watch much TV, and when I do, I don't usually stray from the HD channels. I wasn't even sure this channel was covered by my cable package. Now, I don't know what yours looks like, but the way my cable provider's menu was set up was different colors are supposed to distinguish between different types of shows. You got green for sports, purple for movies, and blue for, well, everything else. However, the menu color for this particular show was black. The text was yellow, which was also very unusual since the show's title was usually always written in white. Even the font was different. Don't ask me to describe what it looked like because I really can't recall, but all I know was that I had never seen the letters written in that way before. I know that sounds odd, but the best description I can give you is that even though the lettering looked completely alien in appearance, my mind could somehow interpret what it said. You shouldn't watch. Now I'm starting to sound like those internet weirdos. Palmer polished off his glass and called the waitress over to order another drink. Anyways, from the second I turned on the program, I knew I was watching something very strange. Very strange, indeed. The black and white picture on my television was of a mostly empty room. There was no visible windows or doors. The place seemed cold and uninviting, like how I imagined a jail cell in Bangladesh would look. Not dead center, but slightly off to the left of the frame was a man. He was sitting at an old rusty table. He was shirtless and looked to be very malnourished. It reminded me of those old photos you see of the Jews who suffered through German concentration camps during World War II. I remember wondering if he was a prisoner there. The frail man wore a pair of tattered slacks, but no belt or shoes. His mouth was hung agape as if his jaw was too heavy to close. There was no music or dialogue. The only noises radiating from my speakers were the sounds of his wheezy, raspy breaths. God, it sounded like he was suffering from emphysema or something. I followed his gaze down to an old rotary phone sitting at the tabletop. He just gawked at the thing like a buffoon, while I stared at the screen, mesmerized by the odd scene that was taking place on my television. I hit the info button, hoping to read the synopsis of what the show was about, but of course there was nothing, so I just kept watching. For minutes, he didn't move. I giggled to myself for a bit, you know, the way you do when something makes you uncomfortable and your brain thinks laughing will ease the tension. The whole time I was waiting, hoping for something that resembled dialogue. Anything to prove that I was just watching some weird movie and had simply tuned in at the wrong time. But nothing ever happened. Perplexed and a little bit bored, I stood up from my couch and headed over to the kitchen to rummage through the fridge for a little late-night snack. I was about halfway done making myself a sandwich when I heard the most terrible noise. Palmer had paused briefly. At first, I thought he had stopped his story because of the waitress returning from the bar with his drink, but he barely acknowledged her presence. The man was caught up in a deep thought, as though he had just remembered something important. When he finally began speaking again, the tone of his voice had completely changed. Gone was the chipper, upbeat person I had come to know him by. Palmer was clearly distraught. The whole thing was utterly repugnant. The man would moan for maybe 40 seconds at a time before stopping suddenly. Then he would just take another deep breath, a wheezy breath, and the terrible sounds would begin again. I cringed as I took it all in. My visual and auditory senses were being assaulted by the most disagreeable amount of stimuli, and I was still fighting off the urge to vomit all over the living room carpet. When I thought things couldn't get worse, the man, still groaning, mind you, turned his head in the direction of the screen and stared straight into the camera. The thing is, I was certain he was looking at me. That's what it felt like. It was almost as if though we were in the same room. I probably should have turned off the show, but after minutes of nothing, something was finally going on, and I felt compelled to keep watching, even though I was suffering immensely. I stared into the glazed-over eyes of the sickly-looking man until he turned his attention down towards the phone sitting on the table. Palmer hunched over in his seat and removed his glasses. He seemed visibly shaken. The 42-year-old econ professor clasped the bridge of his nose between his thumb and his index finger and let out a deep sigh. Beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I haven't thought about this night in a really long time. I suppose it's possible that my mind pushed this episode to the back of my consciousness, and I forgot all about it. Kind of a defense mechanism kind of thing. I read about a case study where Army veterans who witness horrific events develop amnesia about their time in the military. It seems as though I might be going through the same. Except, as I sit here and talk to you, everything begins to come back to me. I asked him if he wanted to continue. He agreed and then resumed his story. His hands quaked violently as he lifted the phone to his ear. His arms were rail thin, and it looked as if though he was struggling mightily to hold it in place. With his other hand, he clumsily started spinning the rotary dial. That's when my cell phone started to ring. A chill ran down my spine. My nausea got even worse. That ominous feeling in the air had transformed into full-on horror. I prayed with every fiber of my being that it was a coincidence as I looked at my phone caller's ID. You have no idea how bad I wanted the number to be one that I recognized. But I didn't recognize it, of course. Hell, it wasn't even a number. It was something else entirely. In the same strange alien text from the TV's menu were the words, "You shouldn't listen," written where the caller number's ID should have been. That was enough for me. I hung up the phone and reached for the remote on the coffee table. I must have pressed the channel button a dozen times, but the picture never changed. I tried the power button and still nothing happened. The man began to dial the phone again, and once more my cell phone started to ring. Palmer had gone pale. He looked completely different from when I first met him. The polar opposite of the smiling man who shook my hand earlier. I tried to turn off the TV manually. I even unplugged it from the wall, but by this time I knew it wouldn't do anything. The sickly pale man continued to stare at me. His horrible, empty gaze fell as if though it was tearing me to pieces. Stomach bile slowly started to crawl up its way up my esophagus. I don't know why I answered the phone. I couldn't help myself. Maybe I thought if I did, it would just all end. My finger trembled as I pressed the answer button. I slowly lifted the phone to my face. I didn't even need to say hello. He just began speaking as if though he was watching me answer the phone through the television screen. And perhaps he was. Tears began to well up in Palmer's eyes. I tried to tell him he didn't need to go into any further details if he was uncomfortable. But he kept talking as if though he never even heard me. By that point, he would have finished his story, even if there was no one sitting across the table from him. He spoke to me in a terrible voice. It sounded like he was gargling shards of glass. His lips moved on the screen, but I can hear him clearly over the phone. He said, "You shouldn't tell." Then in one horribly inhumane quick motion, he leapt out of the frame as the screen went to black. Jesus Christ. He said you shouldn't tell. Did I just tell? Vincent, please, does this mean I just told? Palmer fell silent and stared awkwardly into his glass for a moment. Then he apologized and excused himself from the table. It was the last I saw of him that night. He sent me a text message 15 minutes later explaining that he had to go home and instructed me to charge the bill to his tab. I tried to contact him once I got back to California, but he never answered my calls or my emails. A few weeks later, I found out what had happened to him after performing a simple Google search of his name. 12 days after Alan Palmer and I met to talk about the house on Wendall Lane, he was found dead in his Seattle home. There was no signs of a struggle or forced entry. However, due to the horrific nature of his death, Seattle PD does believe that he was murdered. Palmer's body was discovered in front of the television on his living room couch, missing ears, eyes, and a tongue.